Welcome to Conversations with the Commish. Today I'm pleased to welcome the 5th president of the NCAA, Dr. Mark Emmert. Mark, thanks for being with us.
Great to be with you, John. Pleasure.
When you're out visiting with the Rotary Club or you're talking to your kids, what the heck do you tell them that you do?
You know, that should be a really easy question to answer. but the truth is, most people have enormous misconceptions about what this job is and what it isn't. A lot of people compare it to, like Roger Goodell or Adam Silver or something. And of course, as you well know, and I hope most of your audience knows, the NCAA is anything but that. It's much more like the United Nations. And so when I'm pressed to make a comparison, I say, no. Think about me as Secretary General of the United Nations, taking a few hundred entities and try to get them to all work together and cooperate and come up with decisions collectively. And that's the best descriptor of what I can come up with.
When you go off to college and you study and you're getting into political science and you end up being a professor of political science, and then you start moving up the administrative ranks of universities, and you're a provost and a chancellor at a number of very prestigious institutions. Could you have ever envisioned the day that, boy, I'm going to run the NCAA?
No, to be perfectly blunt about it. In all of my stops, I was always engaged in our athletic programs at each of my campuses as I started to move up through the administrative ranks in one way or another, more so than most of my contemporaries. And so I early on came to understand and appreciate the role that college sports plays at each of those schools and what it meant for the students, both the competitors and the student body more generally. So I was engaged in lots of ways, but I really saw my career path as following along the one that it took. Wound up as president of the University of Washington, my alma mater. Really, honest to goodness, my dream job, a position that I'd thought about since all my adult life, even before in some ways. And so I had no particular need to do anything else. And then, as you well know, Miles Brand suddenly gets sick and dies. Chatting with a whole bunch of university presidents who were engaged in NCAA activities and college sports, we all said, gosh, we got to find another university president to step in, because we all liked that model and didn't want that model to change. And a number of people said, yeah, and it should be you. And I said, no, wrong answer. That's not what I meant. And then, I just got to thinking about it. More people talked to me about it. You start to realize the breadth of the impact you can have on American society, on 500,000 students at any given point in time. It all of a sudden became a pretty natural step in my professional career and my evolution as a leader. So I finally, after about the third iteration of this, said, yeah, let's take a look, and wound up getting the job, and it's been one of the best moves I ever made. Yeah.
We really saw strong moves in the association to have much more presidential participation, presidential ownership of intercollegiate athletics. What does that mean? What is the expectation of the association to the presidents and vice versa?
It's an important and an insufficiently discussed question, I think. It means to me, and what most of the membership sees it as meaning, is that the presidents are the ultimate responsibility. They're the people that at the end of the day, they have to step up and take responsibility for the policies, the strategies of the association. They can't outsource it to anybody. I think what we've seen in that period of time since I've got involved in administration, university presidents can't fob off on their campus and can't say, no, I didn't have anything to do with that. They can't duck and cover from any of these issues, whether they know about it or whether they're engaged or not. When there's a problem or when there's an issue or when there's a need to make an important decision, they have to be involved in it. And they've all come to realize that now, one way or another, that this is maybe a small part of their budget, maybe a small part of their student body, but it has a huge impact on the status and standing and prestige and how people look at their institution, and it's an outsized impact for the proportion of the portfolio of a president, but they got to be very attentive to it, and they get that now. And so they don't want to outsource that to anybody else. They don't want to turn it over to ADs or to commissioners or to anyone else. They want to have that kind of engagement that leads them to be really ultimately in control.
How would you describe your leadership style?
Oh, you know, the advantage of being a little older and having done a lot of jobs is you get to think through yourself as a leader and a manager, and I've tried very hard to be pretty thoughtful about it and reflective about it as time's gone on. I've spent a lot of time watching people who do things that I admire, I watch people do things that I don't admire, and try to learn from all of them. And so I think it's a fairly eclectic approach. I look for the best talent I can possibly bring around me. I try very, very hard to recruit and support the very best folks that I can find. I look for people that are different than me, that bring different skill sets, that have different personalities and different perspectives. And then I try to build a really strong team of those people in my leadership team. And then I try to set the tone, I try to set the boundaries, I try to set, you know, general direction for what we're doing, but then give them a fair amount of latitude and try and build as collegial an environment as I can so that we can argue, we can debate, we can disagree, and collectively come to good decisions, and then make sure that I hold people accountable at the end of it, but give them a lot of latitude to do their work.
What is it about being a student athlete that's so valuable?
Well, I think first of all, it's becoming increasingly valuable because the lessons that can be learned as an athlete are very, very hard to teach in other contexts. If you think about those things that we all learn from sports, you know, resilience, competitiveness, fair play, teamwork, communication, interdependence on others, those are things that become very critical life lessons. They're the kinds of things that allow people to be successful as family members, as community leaders, on the job, and whatever they're doing. Those skills are really critical. And at the same time, they're really hard to teach in a classroom. As a professor, that was hard for me to instill in students. I'd try a lot of different things in the classroom, and you can get little bits and pieces of it. But you know, in a video game world where you can always hit reset, the game's not going well, you just hit reset button. Well, there's no reset button in a basketball game. You're just playing the game. You do something stupid, it's like, well, got to keep right on going. And sports teaches you that. You got to bounce up and get up. People depending on you, you're depending on them. You see it in theater, you see it in music. Some of the performing arts have that same dynamic. But for the most part, the best place to learn all that's in sports.
And interestingly, I'll call it the American model of athletics, we've embedded within our educational systems in many ways all the way through. Starts at the primary level and then the high school level and at the college level. No one else does it that way. Is there value in that? Yeah,
so it is interesting that we in America just take for granted. You know, we assume that it's part of education, right? And we don't even think about the fact that the rest of the world doesn't do this. You've been overseas and you've met leaders from overseas. I've had a lot of university presidents come here and I've been on their campuses overseas. They find this whole college sports thing in America completely bizarre, right? They don't understand it. They don't know what to do with it. Yeah, I find it very, very valuable and a distinctively American thing. And I think in some ways, our engagement in sports at a very early age, whether it's at the collegiate level or not, is in some ways uniquely American and part of the secret sauce of this country. And one of the things that I hope we can continue, again, even at the youth levels, to have connected to our education, that it's not something that becomes elitist, but in fact it's something that's universal.
What's changed in your job from when you started to where we are today?
Well, me, first of all, I hope. I've learned a lot. You know, I came into this job pretty confident that I knew pretty much everything there was to know, and about 6 months in realized I knew very little and was not very confident about what I knew, and I had to change my approach to the job pretty distinctly as I learned more about it. And so I hope that's a big part of it. I think also You know, the impact of social media in that short period of time, you know, in less than a decade now, has become so perverse and pervasive. It's almost as if a lot of social media have been invented just so people can insult each other, and you know, and it hasn't brought out our better angels often, and I think that makes it harder to do anything. Sports is just one example of it. We're all very passionate about sports. It's what we love about it. And now people have an avenue for giving voice to all of their frustrations or disappointments and anger. And that's okay. You know, everybody knows that there's going to be critics out there. And I don't mean of me or even of the NCAA, but you know, when you're being critical of a kid that missed a field goal, or you're, you know, venting at an official who's just trying to call a game, or a coach who's just trying to do his or her best, you know, I think that's been a negative part of it. I think the positive part of it, it's what's changed, has been, you know, everything that's been focused on the student athletes in that same time frame. So we've seen significant investments, not just of money, but of energy and focus on making the student athlete experience better and better and better. And so that's changed at the same time, and I'm really proud of that. So there's been some upsides and some downsides, and a lot of things have moved around. But if you ask me, are we in a better place today than we were 9 years ago? I think we're in a way better place than we were 9 years ago.
What's the favorite or the best part of your job?
Oh, being around students. You know, I miss being on campus because I love being around students. And when I get back on campus, be around student athletes, get to meet with them and talk with them, takes a little while for them to get used to, you know, the guy in the suit. And once you get them to relax and have a real conversation with you, you quickly realize what college sports means to them, how important this experience is, how excited they are about it. Yeah, sure, they got concerns and things they'd like to have changed. But, you know, I almost always end all my conversations by asking them, whether they're Division I, II, or III, big conference, small conference, whatever the sport, I always like to say, if you knew if you knew when you started what you know now, would you still do this? I've never had a student say, oh no, I wish I hadn't done this. They all are pleased that they became a college athlete. Doesn't mean it's easy, doesn't mean that they're thrilled with everything, but they all, when it's all said and done, are delighted that they did it.
You referenced Division I, Division II, Division III, which gets into how diverse the membership of this association is. Mm-hmm. And for the people at home who don't track that, we're really talking about differences in financial aid, not enrollment sizes necessarily. There may be some correlation, but it's financial aid. But you go all the way from non-scholarship programs, very, very modest programs, to huge, fully funded, fully scholarshiped, have all the bells and whistles you could expect. Yeah. And yet you're trying to manage that all under one roof.
Yeah, we talk about the big tent all the time, right? And the tent has to keep a lot of people underneath it, and it could be a really small Division III liberal arts college to, you know, to Ohio State and everything in between. And it's interesting that in the higher ed world, you would almost never have those schools sit down together and talk about their needs and their interests, except inside sports. So the physicist from the great big research university and the physics professor teaching at a little liberal arts school, they might never intersect, but coaches do intersect, and athletes do intersect, and we do have to sit down and talk about how do we make this all work together. And it's fun, it's exciting, it's hard, it's complicated, it's confusing, but somehow we manage to make it all stay together.
One of these days, somewhere years down the road, when you've decided it's time to hang it up and just go back to being a fan, I think we'll look back on your tenure, and one of the more significant things we'll point to is your focus on well-being of student athletes, and probably most particular, the creation of the Sports Science Institute. How did that come about?
Well, first of all, I hope that's true, because I'm incredibly proud of what's going on there. Well, I took this job in 2010, was surprised to find that we the association, weren't giving, what in my opinion was as much attention to physical and mental health issues. We didn't have a chief medical officer. which seemed like a big hole for me. So I created that position, developed it, went out and recruited some people, wound up having a wonderful guy named Dr. Brian Hainline walk in, and Brian said, you know, if I were to come do this, here's one of the things I would want to do too. And he pitched an institute as part of this to really build a portfolio of topics that we could focus our time and energy on and focus research around. And it's just been one of the best things that's happened because it's exploded in importance and its role. Its breadth now is huge. We've got $55 million study now going on concussions, the biggest research project in concussion anywhere in the world that's already providing incredible evidence on what works and what doesn't work to prevent head trauma and concussion. And so we're making great strides in a whole 9 different areas of research. And I think it will continue to expand, and everybody will increase their reliance upon the information and research and education that comes out of that entity.
We seem to be in the middle of this transitional period where we're clearly we're engaging our student athletes more in our decision-making process and our rules-making process. We're I don't know that it's more rights, but we're being more attentive to student-athlete concerns, and so things we're doing with transfer rules and all of these types of things. And so we're trying to come to a delicate balance between our needs and obligations and wants of the students and the needs and obligations and wants of teams, and meshing those two. Is that just the natural evolution of this enterprise?
I think so. I think you described it really nicely because it's about trying to find the right balance. It's part of the lessons of teams, right? There's my individual wants and needs and the team's wants and needs, and those are not identical. And at the same time, there's what the athletic department, a school wants and needs, and the commitments that a student makes to them and the commitments they make to each other. And I think where we are is just starting to rebalance some of that, because at least from the perspective of the 21st century, it maybe was a little out of whack. Mm-hmm. And so the rights and abilities of students to deal with a number of issues versus the team versus the university, I think we're just resetting that a bit. And we're likely to see that be an ongoing process. May well be a push the pendulum too far one way or the other over time. And so you're going to constantly be rebalancing that, would be my guess.
Are there things that keep you up at night?
Yeah, sure. The health and wellness issues keep me up at night. You know, we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to make sure that the games can be played in a way that's as risk-free, never risk-free, but as risk-constrained as possible. You put on a football helmet, you put on pads, you know there's risk. You go into a basketball game, you know there's some risk of injury. You know, any athletic endeavor has some inherent risk in it. We all understand that. But how do we mitigate as much of that as we can? How do we make sure that our rules and our practices are as thoughtful as they can be? So yeah, I worry about that, making sure that we're taking care of young men and young women. I worry about making sure we can keep this enterprise going. With some of the fiscal impact that's being felt right now in higher education generally, we're seeing schools get very concerned about their ability to maintain the level of participation that we have right now. That causes me some anxiety. And I'm both anxious and excited about what we can do with incoming generations of students that haven't been participating in college sports. If you look at some of the rapidly changing demographics of college enrollment right now, there are significant segments of our society that don't even think about college sports. They don't play them much. They don't attend them much. They're not engaged. How do we reach out to those young men and women? How do we bring them into the fold of college sports? May not be an issue for me, might be a generation away from now, but it's certainly occurring, and we need to make sure that this great enterprise can include everybody.
Did you have mentors as you were coming up?
Yeah, I did. Fortunately, I was blessed with a lot of folks who I admired. But, I can't point to one person and say this one was a specific mentor. Like I said earlier, I tended to see the whole person, and so I'd say, well, there's Mark over there, and Mark's pretty good at this, pretty good, not very good at that. And I always tried to pick out the pieces that I could learn from people, and I still do, poke and prod and say, wow, I notice you're really good at this. Tell me about that and how you do it. And from this person you learn energy and focus and drive, and this person you learn communication skills, and this person you learn analytical skills. And so other than the obvious that I had great parents, because I really did, I was very, very lucky. I had a bunch of people that I would point to and say, yeah, there's maybe 5 or 10 people I'd point to as mentors.
Differentiate, you report to a board, actually a couple boards. Board of Governors, which is across all 3 divisions, and then Board of Directors at Division I level, and there's certainly some other checkpoints with Division II and Division III. Contrast that with being president of a university, and I'm assuming the one prepared you pretty well for this stop.
Yeah, actually there's a lot of similarity in that component of it, that universities don't have ownership, right? It's not like a corporation where you've got a board of directors and stockholders and all that. Everybody thinks they own a university, whether they're the citizens or the students or the professors or the sports fans, the politicians. The ownership, if you will, is very diffuse. And so there's this body called the board or the trustees or the regents or whatever they are that represent all those constituencies, but you got to keep an eye on all those various entities out there. So skilled university presidents quickly learn that they've got to manage and find the right balance between a whole lot of different competing interests in a university or a college to make sure that most of the people are happy most of the time with most of the things that you're doing. And this is a little similar to that in that you've got 1,100 schools out there. So, I represent and work for 1,100 different schools, 19,000 teams, 500,000 student athletes. I mean, it's pretty crazy in its complexity. And then our governance structure with the Board of Governors that oversees all of it, that's 25 individuals. And so being a university president's about as good a preparation for that as anything, but you still got a lot of on-the-job training to do.
Where do you see this enterprise a decade from now, if you could speculate?
Well, I think it's still going to be very robust. And I'm extremely confident in that because it continues to grow. We now have more student athletes than ever before, more participation across institutions. It has become a really important part of Americana, if you will. It's pretty embedded in American society. So I think it'll be robust. It will be different in ways that, frankly, I can't quite predict right now. Changing in the media landscape, changing in the economic landscape, that's all going to have effects on it. There's going to be effects from different sports rising in popularity and some perhaps fading in popularity. So I look at some of the sports right now like women's volleyball and beach volleyball that are really, softball really rising in popularity. The impact of lacrosse across the country is growing. So we'll see some shifting around all of that. I don't know what football participation will look like in a decade. We know there's a lot of parents that are holding kids out of football now, so will that shift and they'll start playing baseball instead or whatever the sport du jour will be? It's a little unclear, but I'm very confident it'll continue to be an extremely important part of American higher ed.
Do you have a favorite sport?
Oh, yeah, I always hedge on that question, not because I'm unwilling to say so. It's because I do actually like a whole bunch of them. I love watching football. I love you can't not love basketball, in my opinion, both men's and women's game. It's such a visceral kind of energy around it. But I've really grown to love softball. I love the College World Series. It's an incredible event. I've grown to be fascinated with sports like field hockey, which I'd never attended a field hockey game until I got here. So they all have a very interesting niche and they're all really fun. The best part is just to watch students, doesn't matter, Division I, II, or III, watch students competing at the highest level at one of our championships. You know, you winning a D3 championship, it's every bit as important to those kids as winning a Final Four in the Division I men's basketball tournament. It's almost the same exact emotions, just different crowd size.
Mark, that's probably a good place to end. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on today's edition of Conversations with the Commish.